There are moments in history that feel too heavy to belong to us. Moments where the past stares back so powerfully it feels alive. The Great Pyramid of Giza is one of them. When you look at it long enough, the idea of human achievement starts to blur. You stop seeing blocks and start seeing intention, something deeper than architecture, something that almost feels like it's waiting. For thousands of years, we've told ourselves we built these monuments. We point to chisels, to copper tools, to ropes and ramps. But the stones keep disagreeing. They're too precise, too aligned, too patient for what our ancestors should have been able to do. And so, a question drifts quietly through the centuries, a question most historians avoid saying out loud. What if the pyramids weren't built by humans? Not as a fantasy, not as a headline, but as a genuine possibility, buried beneath layers of sand and certainty. They have been standing there for longer than any language we still speak. The Great Pyramids of Giza, three shapes against the horizon that seem too simple to be mysterious until you start looking at them closely. Then the simplicity collapses. Each block of the Great Pyramid averages more than 2 tons. Some weigh as much as 40. There are more than 2 million of them, lifted, aligned, and placed so precisely that a human hair could not fit between the seams. No mortar binds them. Gravity alone holds them steady. After 40 centuries of wind, earthquakes, and empire, the joints have not moved. It's easy to say this is the result of manpower, thousands of workers, decades of labour. But that explanation dissolves when you try to reproduce it. Modern engineers have attempted it with cranes, laser levels, and software that calculate stress to the millimetre. They can lift the stones, but not without leaving evidence of force, cracks, vibration scars, misalignment that compounds with height. The pyramid does not forgive error. Yet whoever built it didn't just finish it. They achieved perfection, once, at a time when the rest of the world still hunted and gathered. The desert itself seems to protect their secret. Every dawn the sun rises exactly along the pyramid's edge, splitting it in half. Light on one side, shadow on the other. It's a geometry that turns time into an instrument. If you stand there long enough, you begin to notice that the structure is not just built in space, it is built with it. Each face is oriented almost perfectly to the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, west, mapped centuries before magnetic compasses, before the concept of degrees or true north even existed. To find that alignment today, you need mathematics, astronomy, and a concept of the planet as a sphere. They had none of these, or at least none we've recovered. You can feel the difference between explanation and understanding. One tells you that it happened, the other tells you how, and we still don't have the second one. Some scholars point to endless manpower, to ropes and sleds dragging stone across sand lubricated with water. Maybe. But that story doesn't account for the precision of the internal chambers, for the way the air shafts point exactly toward the constellation Orion, or for the resonant frequencies inside the king's chamber that correspond to musical notes and planetary cycles. Those aren't accidents of architecture. They are the fingerprints of intention. It's the same intention you find when you measure the pyramid's base. The ratio between its height and its perimeter encodes P and F, the golden ratio, numbers that describe the curvature of Earth, the growth of plants, the proportions of the human body. It's as if the builders were not simply stacking stones, They were writing the rules of the universe into limestone. Somewhere along the line we started calling them tombs. But no, inscriptions named the dead inside the Great Pyramid. No sarcophagus ever held a pharaoh there. The walls are bare, smooth, silent, undecorated. If they were tombs, they were built for someone who didn't need to be remembered, or someone who would return. Standing beneath that much weight, you begin to sense something modern minds aren't built for. The scale is not just physical, it's conceptual. This was built by people who thought in millennia, not decades. They expected it to survive ice ages, floods, civilizations, and it has. It's like they were building for the planet, not the culture that happened to live on it. We often talk about ancient technology as if it were primitive, but what if the word ancient doesn't mean simple, only old? What if knowledge moves in cycles, rising and falling like the Nile itself? There could have been a time when human hands knew techniques we've since unlearned, when stone was not a mystery but a medium, something shaped by resonance, frequency, or forces we no longer measure. Even now, granite responds to sound. Vibrate it at the right pitch, and it hums. Imagine a civilization that understood that. Imagine a world where construction wasn't brute force but harmony. Stone persuaded into place rather than dragged. Maybe that's why the pyramids feel alive, because they were built with understanding, not only effort, because whoever made them understood the language of the earth itself. There are legends buried in the sand, fragments of stories that speak of the first time, Zep Tepi, the era before kings, when the gods walked beside humanity and taught them the arts of civilization. To the Egyptians, that wasn't myth. It was history recorded in metaphor. When they said the gods, they might have meant something else entirely. Teachers, architects, remnants of a lost world. The memory of people who saw the world ending and built monuments to outlast it. Even the geology hints at it. The stones of the Great Pyramid come from quarries miles away, across the Nile, their paths crossing water that would have made transport nearly impossible. Yet the cuts are clean, the placement exact. It's not impossible to move stone across water if you have buoyancy, counterweight, or machines that harness sound or magnetism rather than muscle. We can't prove they had them, but the absence of proof doesn't erase the evidence of result. Walk around the base and you notice how the structure interacts with you. The closer you get, the less you see of the top. It's as if the pyramid hides its own completion until you step far enough back to understand the pattern. That's not accident. That's design psychology before psychology existed. A reminder that perspective matters, that the whole can only be seen when you stop trying to climb it. There's a humility built into these stones, a message that scale isn't about domination, it's about patience. To build something that lasts, you have to think beyond yourself. Maybe that's the real lesson the builders left, a blueprint for endurance. While we chase efficiency, they pursued eternity, and eternity, it turns out, leaves very few clues. We can carbon date the mortar, trace quarry routes, simulate pulleys, but the feeling remains. We're standing inside a solved equation whose steps we've forgotten. A riddle written in stone that keeps repeating its question every sunrise. The desert winds polish its faces smooth, yet the angles hold. Every century that passes adds another layer of disbelief. Not at the idea that humans built it, but at the idea that we could. Maybe humanity was different then, not in form but in focus. Maybe they weren't stronger, just more aligned, with each other, with the planet, with something we no longer feel. Whatever it was, it left behind this monument, a machine made of stone built to outlive its makers, quietly watching as ages come and go. We call it ancient, but maybe it's still working, just in a way we no longer understand. If you step inside, the air changes. Sound behaves differently. Every breath echoes as if the walls themselves are listening. The deeper you go, the more it feels like you're walking through the body of something that's alive. Stone that remembers vibration instead of language. The corridors are narrow, deliberate. They guide you downward first, then upward, then suddenly open into silence. The king's chamber. No carvings, no colour, just blocks of red granite that seem to hum even when you stand still. If you clap, the echo doesn't return, it expands. A resonance builds in the air, low and steady, like the planet taking a slow breath. Some engineers have measured it. The frequency, 432 Hz, the same vibration found in the natural rhythms of Earth, in the pattern of human heartbeat, in the wavelength of light that marks the edge of dawn. Coincidence or calibration? To tune a room like that, you'd need to know how stone carries sound, how density converts vibration to energy. You'd need to understand physics at a level we only rediscovered in the last century. So maybe the pyramid isn't a tomb, maybe it's an instrument, not a machine of gears and metal, but of proportion and resonance. A device that translates the language of the planet into form and then back into sound. If you think of it that way, its design begins to make sense. The shafts that point toward Orion and Sirius aren't decorations, they're alignments. The chambers stacked in harmonic ratios aren't coincidences, they're notes. Together they form a symphony written in limestone. Some researchers have suggested that the pyramids could amplify natural vibrations, a kind of ancient seismograph or energy converter. Others think they acted as calendars, tracking cycles not just of the sun and stars but of Earth's own pulse. Each theory touches a truth, but never holds it. Maybe that's the point. Whatever knowledge the builders had, they hid it in plain sight. Inside mathematics, inside music, inside silence. If you look at the base from above, you'll notice something strange. The length of each side is almost perfectly equal, yet each corner curves slightly, just enough to compensate for the curvature of Earth. It's a correction you'd make only if you knew the planet was round, centuries before anyone proved it. And the perimeter, multiplied by scale, equals exactly the circumference of the Earth at its equator. That's not luck. That's data. Information encoded in architecture. As if the builders wanted to leave a message, not in words that could be forgotten, but in geometry that would always be true. What would drive someone to do that? Not vanity, not even faith. Something deeper. Preservation. A civilization aware that time erases memory might build memory into matter. They might decide that the only way to speak to the future is to use the only medium that doesn't die. Stone. And so they carved their understanding of the world into a structure large enough to survive ignorance itself. We often imagine progress as a straight line, primitive to advanced, dark to light. But history behaves more like a heartbeat, rising and falling, pausing, restarting. Knowledge peaks, collapses, and returns in fragments. Maybe the pyramids are the proof of one of those peaks, a time when humans, or someone like us, reached a level of understanding we haven't yet repeated. Then something happened. A flood, a shift, a forgetting, and the light went out. Only the monuments remained, like backup drives for a vanished civilization. Every culture has its own echo of that story. Atlantis swallowed by the sea, the lost city of Z, the deluge that cleansed the world. We treat them as myths because we can't imagine technology older than ourselves. But the evidence doesn't need to be electrical to be advanced. Knowledge can be acoustic, magnetic, geometric. It can hide in proportion and pressure instead of circuits. A frequency generator built from granite would leave no wires, no metal, only angles and voids. The perfect stealth technology is time. Inside the Grand Gallery, the walls narrow until the passage feels less like a hallway and more like a conduit. Light from a torch flickers in exact rhythm with the slope. Some believe this corridor once contained a mechanism, wooden beams or resonant stones that channeled vibration upward, focusing energy into the chamber above. Maybe it was ritual, maybe it was function. But standing there, you understand why the ancients called the pyramid Akhet, the horizon, the place where earth meets the sky. It wasn't just a monument to death, it was a bridge between frequencies, between realms of matter and thought. Outside, the desert amplifies silence. Inside, the silence amplifies you. Every heartbeat feels like part of a larger rhythm, one that the builders might have heard long before they carved the first block. Perhaps they built to keep that rhythm alive, to make sure the planet never stopped singing. When archaeologists first opened the pyramid, they found no treasure, no sarcophagus of gold. Just a granite box precisely cut, resonant to the touch. It fits no human comfortably. Its purpose remains unrecorded. To some, it's a coffin. To others, a tuning chamber. The difference is intent. One serves the dead, the other speaks to eternity. Whichever it is, it has done its job. We are still listening. The deeper you think about it, the more it feels as if the pyramid wasn't built to store a body, but a memory. The memory of what we once knew. A manual written in dimension and ratio, waiting for us to learn its language again. Because stone forgets nothing. It simply waits for questions intelligent enough to unlock it. Look at how sunlight moves across its face each day. At dawn, it divides perfectly in half. At noon, it becomes blinding. At dusk, the shadow of its tip stretches, exactly the length of its base. It measures not only time, but balance, a harmony between light and dark that ancient architects must have understood intimately. This isn't just engineering, it's philosophy carved in geometry, a belief that equilibrium is sacred, that symmetry is truth. Perhaps that's why we keep returning to it, why every few generations someone stands before the pyramid and feels that same vertigo of recognition. Because somewhere deep down, we remember. We recognize the intelligence that built it, even if we can't name it. It feels familiar, like something our species once knew and lost. The archaeologists will keep digging, the scientists will keep measuring, and the desert will keep whispering. But the pyramid will not explain itself. That's its final brilliance. It refuses to give us closure. It makes us participate. To understand it, we have to change how we think. Slow down, listen, feel scale not as height, but as patience. That's why it still matters. It's not just a monument to the past, it's a mirror for our limits. When you step back into the sunlight after standing inside, the world feels lighter, less certain. The horizon bends in ways you didn't notice before. The sky looks wider, the sand more deliberate. For a moment, you can almost believe that everything around you, the wind, the temperature, the way sound fades, is part of a design too vast to see. And maybe that's exactly what the builders wanted. Not worship, not proof, but awareness. To make us look again at the world and realize it has always been capable of more than we imagine. Because the pyramid is still working, not as a power source or a beacon, but as an idea, a machine that runs on curiosity. And as long as we keep asking how, it keeps performing its purpose, reminding us that mystery is not ignorance, it's invitation. At first glance, the pyramids look like art born from muscle, geometry raised by willpower. But beneath the stone is a language of numbers so exact it begins to sound less like construction and more like encryption. Whoever designed these structures wasn't just stacking blocks. They were solving an equation in 3 dimensions. If you measure the Great Pyramid carefully enough, patterns start to appear. The height multiplied by 40^200 equals the polar radius of the Earth. Its perimeter multiplied by the same number equals the planet's circumference. No decimals, no rounding errors. The precision sits where modern geodesy would place it today. That's an accuracy we didn't achieve with satellites until the 20th century. Some say it's coincidence, but coincidences rarely multiply. Inside the same walls, ratios of P and F show up again and again. The circle, the spiral, the growth of seashells and galaxies alike. Mathematics that describe nature itself, carved into limestone when much of humanity still counted on fingers. It's easy to shrug at that. Numbers are universal after all. But the combinations here feel deliberate, as if the builders wanted to show they understood the same code that shapes everything else. To them, geometry might not have been mathematics. It might have been theology, a way to speak directly to the universe using proportion instead of prayer. The pyramid slope is 51 degrees 51 minutes, the angle that allows the structure to hold its own weight perfectly, yet it also produces a ratio that mirrors the golden mean. The same proportion appears in the spiral of DNA, the pattern of hurricanes, the orbit of Venus relative to Earth. It's an angle that seems to connect living forms to celestial ones. Standing at the base, you can almost feel that number radiating upward, like a tuning fork pressed against time. We measure such precision with lasers. They managed it with sightlines, stars, and patience. The 4 sides point almost perfectly north, south, east, and west, off by less than 1/15 of a degree. Even our most advanced buildings drift more than that as materials expand and contract. Yet the pyramid sits unmoved, as if the desert itself obeys its alignment. So what were they calculating? Maybe they weren't measuring Earth at all. Maybe they were measuring stability, a design that could survive tectonic drift, pole shifts, centuries of erosion. To achieve that, you'd need a sense of scale beyond the human lifetime. You'd need to think in the mathematics of epochs. Some believe these alignments served ritual purpose, tracking solstices, mapping the afterlife, tying heaven and earth together. But the deeper you look, the less it feels symbolic, and the more it feels functional. The pyramid behaves like a clock that measures more than hours. It measures balance. If the earth wobbled, if true north changed, this monument would show it first. It's both calendar and compass. It's very existence proof that someone cared enough about precision to make it eternal. Numbers like these don't survive by chance. They survive because someone built a library that doesn't burn. Every edge, every ratio is a page. Over time, we lost the ability to read them, but the text remains. And the more we learn about physics, the more that text begins to sound familiar. When we map energy fields around the pyramid today, instruments pick up weak electromagnetic harmonics. Nothing supernatural, just the way certain shapes focus radiation and radio waves. But it's uncanny how the Great Pyramid seems to amplify frequencies associated with the Earth's natural Schumann resonance. 8 Hertz, the heartbeat of the planet. It's as if the entire structure hums in sympathy with Earth itself. An accident, maybe, but an accident that perfect is indistinguishable from design. Ancient builders didn't use numbers for abstraction, they used them for survival. Floods, crops, stars, all demanded measurement. But at some point measurement became revelation. When you realize that the same constant describes a circle and the orbit of a planet, the line between counting and worship blurs. You start to see numbers as divine fingerprints, and that may be what the pyramids record, a map of how the world expresses itself mathematically. Consider how their design scales. If you shrink the Earth down until the Great Pyramid fits within a human hand, the ratio of its curvature, its mass, its angles, still echo the larger world. That's not mysticism, that's geometry behaving like memory. The structure mirrors its environment, perhaps intentionally, perhaps instinctively, but always precisely. So maybe the architects weren't guessing at gods or chasing immortality. Maybe they were documenting a truth so large it could only be written in miles of stone. A truth about proportion, rhythm, and the way order hides inside chaos. To leave behind something that endures, you can't just build, you must harmonize. Numbers make that harmony possible. When you realize this, the pyramid stops looking like architecture and starts looking like notation. A chord frozen in rock. You can't hear it, but you can sense it, vibrating invisibly, resonating through time. It's mathematics you can walk inside, a cathedral built not for worship but for comprehension. That may be why standing near it feels like standing near an answer you can't yet translate. The mind senses coherence long before it deciphers it. You feel it in your spine. This is not random. This is intention solidified. The more we learn, the clearer the paradox becomes. The builders were either impossibly lucky, or they knew something about Earth, gravity, and vibration that we've only just rediscovered. Either possibility changes everything, because if they could encode planetary constants into limestone, then they understood our world at a scale we barely grasp even with computers, and if they did, that thousands of years ago the story of civilization isn't a ladder, it's a circle. If the numbers inside the pyramid are deliberate, then they weren't written just to be admired. They were meant to be used. To someone who understood them, the monument would have been more than a building. It would have been an instrument of calculation, a physical model of the world. Look closely, and you start to see relationships that feel less like art and more like design parameters. The ratio between the height and the base matches the geometry of a sphere projected onto a plane. It's the same math that modern engineers use to model gravitational fields. Somehow, the builders shaped that abstraction into stone without algebra, without metal tools, without the vocabulary we use to describe it. How? The easy answer is coincidence. The harder answer is that they knew something fundamental, something we've forgotten. Not magic, but technique. A deep familiarity with vibration, weight, and angle, learned through centuries of experiment and oral tradition. Maybe that knowledge was inherited from a culture older than history. Maybe it was born from direct observation, the patient watching of tides, stars, and seasons until pattern became law. There's a theory that the Great Pyramid encodes a unit of measurement called the sacred cubit. When converted into modern meters, it aligns almost perfectly with the wavelength of light at the center of the visible spectrum. It's as if their definition of length came from light itself, not from any human scale. If true, that would mean they built using the same constants that shape the universe, a kind of universal standard that links photons to stone. That's what makes the pyramid so unsettling. Its logic is timeless. Every calculation inside it remains valid. Empires collapse, languages die, and yet its math still works. It's as if the builders were speaking to anyone who could count, across thousands of years, across whatever future might exist. We tend to assume that knowledge always improves with time, that progress is inevitable. But what if progress is cyclical? What if civilizations rise, reach a peak of understanding, then fall, leaving fragments too complex for their descendants to decode? The pyramid could be one of those fragments, a data archive disguised as architecture. When you build in stone, you're not communicating with your neighbors, you're communicating with deep time. Maybe that's why we find the same numbers scattered through myths. 42, the number of principles in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. 360, the degrees of a circle. 12,900, the approximate years between ice ages. Patterns repeat like echoes, as if the builders wanted to hide their message not in a single clue, but in recurrence itself. Repetition ensures survival. If you forget one example, another will remind you. Archaeologists catalogue these coincidences patiently, but they rarely ask the larger question: why does the pyramid teach through pattern? Maybe the answer is that the builders wanted to provoke curiosity, not obedience. They didn't want worshippers, they wanted students. A structure like this turns anyone who studies it into a scientist. You begin by asking how it was built, and end by asking how the universe works. And in that way, it still performs its purpose. Even now, the pyramid makes us do what it was designed to make us do. Think. To test our limits, to measure ourselves against scale, to see how small we are next to intention that grand. Walk around its base at dusk. The heat of the day radiates out of the limestone. You can feel it against your skin. For a moment, it's as if the monument breathes. The shadow stretches exactly the length of the base, a silent equation written in light. When the last ray disappears, you're left with geometry and darkness, and they feel identical. Maybe that's the secret. The builders didn't separate science from spirit, or art from engineering. To them, numbers were not abstractions, but sacred realities, bridges between worlds. The structure they left behind is proof of that worldview, a place where calculation becomes meditation. And so the pyramid remains, half solved, half remembered. Every measurement we take is another question it asks back at us. It doesn't argue, it simply waits, confident that one day someone will learn its language again. Until then, It stands like a theorem that refuses to end with an equal sign. The desert hums softly at night, wind passing over stone edges that have measured centuries. If you listen carefully, you might think you hear it whispering its constants, the slow recitation of a formula so vast it needs an entire planet to express it. Maybe that's all the builders wanted, to show that Earth itself is part of a larger equation, and that we, for a brief moment, have the privilege of solving a few of its lines. Before Egypt became desert, it was green. The Sahara wasn't a sea of sand, but a landscape of lakes and rivers, alive with grass, hippos, crocodiles, and rain. If you could travel back 12,000 years, you'd find forests where dunes now stand, thunderheads rolling across skies that haven't known clouds for millennia. It was another world, and somewhere inside that world, something remarkable was happening. The rocks around the Sphinx tell the story quietly. Geologists studying the erosion patterns notice something strange. The deep, rounded grooves along its flanks weren't made by wind. They were carved by water, rainfall, heavy and prolonged, the kind Egypt hasn't seen since the end of the last ice age. If those marks are natural, they predate the pharaohs by thousands of years, which means the Sphinx and perhaps the pyramids nearby stand on foundations older than recorded history, older than our idea of civilization itself. It's a detail so simple that it threatens to rewrite everything. Because to imagine the Sphinx already ancient before Egypt rose is to imagine builders who came before the first kings, people capable of quarrying, aligning, and designing monuments that would outlast continents. No one knows their names. They left no stories, only stone. We've been taught that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent around 3000 BC, a neat narrative of progress from caves to cities. But the Earth has always been more complicated than our timelines. When sea levels were lower, entire coastlines now buried beneath the waves were dry and inhabited. Archaeologists have found traces of settlements off the coast of India, Japan, and the British Isles. Doorsteps, walls, pottery, all resting below the ocean floor. The water rose slowly, but not evenly. Around 10,000 BC, something accelerated the melt, a sudden warming event known as the Younger Dryas termination. Glaciers collapsed, oceans surged upward more than 100 meters. For anyone living then, it wouldn't have been gradual. It would have been catastrophic. Flood myths are what survivors tell when the sea takes the land overnight. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the Andes to the Pacific Islands, every ancient culture remembers the same story. A world destroyed by water, and a few who escape to begin again. In Sumerian tablets, it's Ziusudra. In the Bible, Noah. In Egypt, the god Thoth warns of the great flood that will cleanse the earth. Different names, same memory. It's as if humanity carries the trauma of that deluge in its DNA. So imagine what it must have been like to stand on the edge of that change, to see coastlines vanish, to watch the horizon drown. If you knew your world was ending, what would you try to preserve? Maybe you'd write books, carve tablets, teach your children. Or maybe you'd build something that couldn't wash away. Something vast enough to survive ignorance. A monument to memory itself. That's what the pyramids might be. Not tombs for kings, but vaults for knowledge. When the sea rose, it didn't just erase villages, it erased proof. Every shoreline settlement from that era would now be hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water, unreachable except by sonar. If there were libraries, observatories, or machines, they're gone. All that remains are mountains of limestone too heavy for time to move. The survivors, if there were any, would have carried their fragments of knowledge inland, to higher ground, to the Nile Valley that would become Egypt. They would have taught what they could remember, built what they could still design, and tried to encode the rest in symbol. To later generations, they would look like gods. There are hints of that inheritance in Egyptian myth. They spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, the golden age when the gods themselves walked among humans and taught them writing, geometry, astronomy. Later dynasties revered that age but didn't claim to have lived it. They were caretakers, not originators. Pharaohs called themselves restorers of what had been built before. They didn't invent the idea of the pyramid, they copied it. Each successive version, smaller and less precise, like echoes fading down a long hallway. If the Great Pyramids of Giza were the originals, everything that followed was a reproduction made by people who could no longer understand the language of their ancestors. The craftsmanship declined because the memory had, and if that's true, then our history isn't a line of advancement, it's a loop. Civilization rises, falls, forgets, and then tries to remember by imitating what it no longer comprehends. Think of the precision of those early builders. Stones cut so flat you can't slip a credit card between them. Corners aligned with a true north that drifts by fractions of a degree every millennium. Whoever did this was working with knowledge of astronomy, geography, and engineering so advanced it feels out of place. It's not that they had lasers or cranes, it's that they had understanding. They knew how to read the planet, how to work with the physics of weight and balance instead of against it. They weren't fighting gravity, they were using it. Maybe that's the real technology we've lost. Not machines, but perspective. A relationship with the natural world so intimate that construction became collaboration. The same intuition that allowed Polynesians to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean without maps, reading the stars and the waves, may have allowed these architects to build in harmony with the Earth's magnetic and acoustic fields. We call it primitive because it leaves no machines behind, but perhaps the machines were unnecessary. Archaeologists dig for evidence and find only absence. That absence has its own kind of voice. It tells us there was more than we know, but less than we can prove. The flood took everything except what was indestructible. That's why the pyramids matter, not just because they survived, but because they remembered. Each one is a stone data capsule, its language written in proportion and alignment instead of words. A global reset button pressed by nature, followed by an attempt to rebuild from memory. And perhaps that's what we're doing even now, rediscovering, reinventing, relearning truths that were already known once before. Every advance we make feels new, but what if it's just recollection? What if progress is remembering faster? Stand in front of the Great Pyramid at sunset, and the desert glows like embers. You can almost see the shadow of the sea that once covered this land. Imagine the survivors dragging their knowledge inland, carrying blueprints that no longer matched the world's new shape. They must have known they couldn't rebuild everything, but they could build one thing perfectly. A monument that would outlive the flood, a message to whoever came next, something that would tell them, we were here and we knew. When the waters finally began to fall, the world that emerged was not the same. The coastlines had shifted, rivers had found new beds, mountains had become islands. What remained of humanity was scattered across the higher ground, small clusters of survivors staring out over an ocean that had stolen their maps. Imagine what it must have been like to inherit that silence. Generations born after the catastrophe would have known only fragments, stories of ancestors who once mastered the forces of nature, who built cities of light and sound, who watched them vanish beneath the sea. Myths were not fantasies then, they were memories written in metaphor. And from these fragments, people began to build again. Along the banks of a new river, a group of those survivors found the valley that would become Egypt. They would have seen the Nile not as a border, but as a memory of what had been lost, a lifeline that rose and fell with the same rhythm as the tides that had drowned their world. They settled where the soil stayed fertile, where the stars still mirrored the patterns they had once known, and slowly they began to remember. The first monuments of Egypt look almost like sketches, as if the builders were practicing an older art they didn't fully understand. Mud brick mastabas, simple mounds rising from the sand. Then, abruptly, the step pyramid of Djoser appears, a structure that seems too advanced to have no precedent. Its architect, Imhotep, is remembered as a genius, a healer, a magician. But what if he was less an inventor and more a translator? Someone rediscovering blueprints that predated him by centuries. Every civilization begins somewhere, but sometimes its roots lie in ruins it no longer remembers making. We like to think that progress moves in straight lines, yet archaeology keeps finding curves. Artifacts that appear before their supposed invention. Maps showing coastlines that should have been unknown. Astronomical alignments too precise for chance. Each discovery feels like an echo, a whisper from that earlier age that refused to die completely. The pyramids of Giza may be the loudest of those echoes, but they're not alone. Step pyramids appear in Sudan, in Mesopotamia, in South America and China, each culture claiming the design as its own, yet all sharing the same geometry. It's as if the survivors carried a single memory with them and rebuilt it wherever they went. They probably didn't call it geometry. To them it was sacred proportion, the visible form of balance. They built temples where earth met sky because they remembered what happened when that balance was lost. They aligned stone with stars, not to worship them, but to keep the memory of the heavens anchored to the ground. The sky had been their calendar, their warning system, their storybook. When the old world drowned, the constellations stayed. Rebuilding under those same stars was a way of telling time again. Every generation after the flood must have felt both awe and grief, a sense of living in the shadow of greatness. They remembered enough to copy shapes, but not enough to explain them. Ritual replaced understanding, myth replaced method, and yet the effort to rebuild was itself an act of remembrance. They couldn't restore the machines of the past, but they could preserve the principles: symmetry, harmony, orientation, endurance. Those principles became religion. The gods of Egypt, Thoth, Osiris, Isis, may have begun as titles, not deities, roles passed down from the architect of the age before, teachers who became legends, legends that became immortals. It's a pattern that repeats whenever memory fades. Names become symbols, symbols become stories, stories become scripture. but hidden within the story is always a trace of fact. Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, said to have built the first temple with words of power. Perhaps the words were formulas, the power mathematics. Osiris, dismembered and reassembled, perhaps a metaphor for a shattered civilization pieced together from fragments. The myth keeps the knowledge alive, even when the knowledge can no longer be spoken directly. When the first true pharaohs rose, they inherited not only land but the ruins of something older. They called those ruins the houses of eternity. They didn't claim to have built them, they claimed to have restored them. The rituals that surrounded kingship, the weighing of the heart, the journey through the stars, all feel like translations of ideas that once described physics and astronomy. Over centuries they became moral lessons, then religious rites. But the structure of the myth still matches the structure of the cosmos. Perhaps that's why it lasted so long, because it was built on truths that don't expire. Every so often the flood story returns, not in water, but in awareness. Scholars find patterns that shouldn't exist. Explorers stumble upon artifacts that rewrite timelines. Each discovery is like the sea pulling back for an instant, revealing a glimpse of the old coastline before covering it again. We see just enough to know there's more, never enough to map it completely. Think of the megalithic sites scattered across the world. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its pillars carved 12,000 years ago, deliberately buried by its own builders. The Yonaguni structures beneath the waters of Japan, terraces and steps carved into bedrock now 15 meters underwater. The ruins of Dwarka off India's coast, where divers found walls and streets dated to the very dawn of civilization. Each of these sites bends the timeline back on itself. Each hints at a culture that knew how to move stone, read stars, and anticipate catastrophe. And then, suddenly, chose silence. Maybe that's the most haunting part. The deliberate burying, the sealing away. Göbekli Tepe wasn't destroyed by enemies. It was covered carefully, preserved under sand. That doesn't look like collapse, it looks like preparation. As if someone knew another flood was coming and wanted their knowledge to survive in a form that couldn't rot. Maybe the pyramids were built with the same purpose, to be understood later when humanity was ready again. If you read ancient texts with that in mind, small phrases begin to glow. In the Edfu temple inscriptions, the gods speak of a time when the island of the egg was destroyed and the builder gods came to re-establish order. On that island they built the first temple, a model for all to follow. Those carvings don't describe a metaphorical flood, they describe a real event. They remember water that rose until the sky wept, and survivors who carried the words of creation to a new land. That new land, the text says, was Egypt. Maybe those words of creation weren't incantations at all, but instructions, measurements, alignments, equations. If knowledge was once spoken as rhythm and proportion, the act of rebuilding would have sounded like music. Each block placed in time with the beat of the world, each structure tuned to the same frequencies that make atoms dance. Civilization reborn as architecture, memory reborn as sound made solid. We still live among those survivors, in a sense. Every city, every tower, every act of rebuilding after disaster is an echo of that first attempt to outwit time. We may not build in limestone, but we build with the same desire, to be remembered, to leave proof that we understood something true. When we launch satellites, map DNA, or search for habitable planets, we're doing what the survivors of the flood did, looking for stability after chaos. They built pyramids, we build data centers, different materials, same hunger. Standing in the desert at night, you can feel that lineage stretching behind you. The wind hisses over the sand like the retreating surf of an ocean that never quite left. Above, Orion's belt hangs over the horizon, the same stars the builders once watched. For a moment, you understand why they aligned everything to the sky. Because the stars are the only landmarks that survived the flood. What remains of their language comes to us through proportion, through myth, through resonance. We keep trying to translate it back into words and fail, because it wasn't written for words, it was written for experience. To stand before a pyramid is to read the oldest sentence ever written. We endured. Those who built it wanted whoever came after to know that endurance is possible, even after the world ends. In that sense, the flood never stopped, it just changed form. Now the water is time, slow, invisible, eroding memory grain by grain, and the pyramids are still holding the line against it, the last bastions of a civilization that refused to be erased. When the archaeologists of the future dig through our own ruins, they'll find concrete and glass instead of limestone, microchips instead of scrolls. But maybe somewhere beneath all of it, they'll feel the same question rising, the same one the survivors carved into stone and left for us. What will you leave behind when the sea comes again? Night in the desert doesn't arrive. It descends. The horizon dissolves first, then the dunes, then even the sense of distance. Only the stars remain, bright enough to cast faint shadows on the sand. It's here that the pyramids reveal another purpose, one you can't see in daylight. For thousands of years they have stood like instruments tuned to the heavens. Every edge, every angle, every narrow shaft that threads through stone points to something in the sky. They are the oldest observatories on Earth, built not to watch time pass, but to hold it still. Look north. The Great Pyramid's entrance once faced the star Thuban, the pole star of 2500 BC. When the Earth's axis shifted, that alignment changed, but the intention remained clear. Someone understood precession, the slow wobble of the planet that takes 26,000 years to complete. They built for it, as if to say, we know the sky moves, but our knowledge will not. To track a cycle that long, you need records stretching across generations. You need patience that outlives memory. You need a reason bigger than religion. Maybe the builders weren't trying to worship the stars at all. Maybe they were trying to remember a message written in their motion. If you plot the 3 pyramids of Giza on a map, they match the 3 stars of Orion's belt, not approximately, but with the same irregular spacing and orientation. The Nile flows beside them just as the Milky Way flows beside Orion in the sky. As above, so below, a reflection of the heavens etched onto the earth. That phrase, as above, so below, appears in texts written millennia later, but its meaning may have started here. The idea that the cosmos and the world are mirrors, each explaining the other. The builders encoded that belief in stone so no translation could distort it. If the stars shifted, the monument would show how far, and perhaps why. Imagine standing at the base at midnight 4,000 years ago, the air still, the horizon clear. Through the southern shaft you would see Orion rising, his belt perfectly framed. Through the northern shaft, a faint red point. Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Every year, the heliacal rising of Sirius announced the flooding of the Nile. The entire rhythm of Egyptian life, planting, harvest, festival, depended on that single moment. The pyramid didn't just mark it, it predicted it. Stone turned into calendar. To us that seems practical. To them it was sacred. The flood was renewal, the Nile a heartbeat, the stars the pulse that kept it steady. Watching the heavens was how they listened to the planet. The priests of Heliopolis weren't astrologers, they were astronomers of survival. They measured eternity to feed a civilization. But there's something deeper beneath that precision. The same shafts that mark the rising of Sirius also point to regions of the sky we still don't fully understand. The place the ancient texts called the imperishable stars, the ones that never set. To them, those stars were gates, not destinations but directions, routes by which the soul, or perhaps knowledge itself, could travel. Modern researchers find that same geometry echoed in temples across the Nile, Dendera, Karnak, Abu Simbel, all aligned with celestial events. Together they form a vast network of sky markers, a map not of land but of motion. If you connect the points, they trace the paths of stars as they move through the ages, like dots in a cosmic time-lapse. Someone wanted the future to see that the heavens had changed. Maybe because the last time they changed so dramatically the world drowned. The builders could have known this from observation alone. Watching the same sky every night for generations, patterns emerge. Stars that drift, constellations that tilt, climates that follow. They may have realized that cosmic rhythm and earthly weather were bound together, that what happened above echoed below. If the axis shifted, rivers rose. If the stars realigned, the seasons did too. Knowledge like that isn't superstition, it's science written in patience. That's what separates myth from ignorance. When the ancients spoke of God sailing the sky in luminous boats, they might have been describing the motion of planets. When they spoke of battles between Horus and Set, they could have been describing eclipses, the struggle of light and shadow. Their stories were code, their temples algorithms. They just used poetry instead of mathematics. There's a kind of humility in that. They didn't pretend to own the truth. They built a dialogue with it. By fixing their monuments to the stars, they admitted their dependence on something greater. We build to control. They built to align. That difference might explain why their works endure while ours crumble. The desert sky still carries their message. During certain nights of the year, the Milky Way arches perfectly over the pyramids, and the reflection between heaven and earth becomes complete again. Photographs capture it now, but the experience belongs to the body, not the camera. You feel it as balance, a resonance between your heartbeat and the slow turn of the planet. It's the same resonance ancient priests must have felt when they saw Orion rise exactly where their ancestors promised it would. A confirmation that memory, when written precisely enough, can survive the motion of the universe. Some researchers have suggested that the Great Pyramid could even have served as an astronomical instrument, its internal angles corresponding to the arcs of solar and stellar paths. Others think it was a simulator, a place to model celestial mechanics using light and shadow. When the sun entered its corridors, it would trace beams that marked solstice, equinox, and the subtle drift of time itself, stone as telescope, sunlight as lens. If that's true, then every sunrise and sunset for the past 45 centuries has been part of the same experiment. Consider what that means. They didn't separate heaven from earth. To study one was to understand the other. They built observatories not to escape the world, but to stay in sync with it. Each alignment was a promise that humanity would remember its place within the cosmos, not above it. Maybe that's the lesson we've forgotten. We look up and see distance. They looked up and saw continuity. To them, the stars were family, older, wiser relatives whose movements shaped fate. The pyramids are their attempt to stay in conversation, to keep the dialogue going even after the speakers were gone, and it worked. Thousands of years later, the alignment still speaks. We can measure its precision with lasers and satellites, but the message remains the same. You are part of a larger pattern. Learn its rhythm, and you will endure. Stand there on a still night, and the silence feels intelligent. You start to sense what the builders must have felt. The realization that knowledge doesn't have to be written to be preserved. It can live in proportion, in placement, in the gentle relationship between sky and stone. Even now, as the earth continues its slow wobble, the pyramids adjust by doing nothing, allowing the heavens to move around them like a compass needle finding north. Perhaps that's their most profound function, not to point outward, but inward, to remind us that the universe is not elsewhere. It's mirrored here, in everything solid, in every breath. When you finally look away from the stars and back to the desert, you realize the builders weren't trying to reach the heavens, they were trying to bring them home. When you stare long enough into the night sky, you begin to feel watched. Not in the fearful sense, but as though the universe notices you back. That quiet reciprocity, that echo, is at the heart of why the ancients built the way they did. They weren't only observing the heavens, they were answering them. Every civilization that remembers the flood also remembers teachers who came afterward, carrying knowledge of the stars. They taught how to read the heavens like a clock, to know when floods would come, when the seasons would change, when to plant, when to pray. To them, astronomy wasn't science, it was survival. But somewhere along the line, survival became reverence. The more they studied, the more they realized the sky wasn't chaos. It was a language, and it could be read. The pyramid was built as a translator between the two worlds, the shifting, glowing map above and the dense, silent matter below. Its perfect orientation to the cardinal points was a form of grammar. Its angles, syntax, its chambers, punctuation. A message written from humanity to the cosmos. We understand your pattern. We remember your rhythm. If you overlay a map of the stars onto the Giza Plateau, you find that each monument corresponds not only to Orion's belt, but to specific declinations, distances, and magnitudes, variables that change slowly as the Earth precesses. That suggests the builders intended the correlation to evolve. As centuries passed and the sky drifted, the pyramids would no longer match exactly. The misalignment wasn't failure. It was the clock ticking. They built time into geometry. Inside ancient temples, the same logic continued. At Dendera, shafts of light still fall across carvings of constellations precisely when their real counterparts appear overhead. At Abu Simbel, twice a year, sunlight reaches deep into the inner sanctum to illuminate the statues of the gods, once to mark the beginning of the harvest season, once to mark its end. These weren't coincidences of architecture, they were confirmations of dialogue. Every beam of light, every shadow, a word exchanged between human and star. It's difficult for us to think this way now. We live beneath the same sky but rarely see it. Our lights drown the constellations, and our calendars keep time for us. We've outsourced the heavens to algorithms, but the builders of the pyramids carried the night inside them. They looked up and saw structure, equations glowing. To build in harmony with that pattern was to belong to it. To misalign would be sacrilege. Maybe that's what they meant when they spoke of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that keeps chaos at bay. To live by Ma'at was not a moral code. It was physics with reverence. Every temple, every street, every measure of a coffin or column followed its ratios. The world was supposed to echo the sky, and the sky, in turn, was expected to respond. When drought came or the river failed, it wasn't just climate. It was misalignment, a signal that something had slipped out of rhythm. To restore that rhythm, they turned again to geometry. They adjusted the calendar, reoriented temples, rebuilt altars, all to bring the earth back into phase with the heavens. And when the alignments returned, so did the floods, the crops, the stability. They didn't pray for miracles, they engineered them. In modern terms, you could call it feedback, the planet and its inhabitants operating as one resonant system. But to the ancients, it was simply respect. They treated the universe as alive, aware, self-correcting. To carve stone according to stellar law was a way of saying thank you. Every block laid true was an offering, a promise to keep listening. The celestial code was never a set of numbers locked in secret texts. It was a habit of thought. It told them that everything repeats, that cycles rule all things, that destruction is never final because the sky always comes back. They built for that return. They believed that when the stars regained the same configuration as the night of creation, balance would be restored again, a renewal of order after chaos. That moment was not superstition, it was calculation. They tracked it in precession, in eclipses, in the slow drift of Sirius. They could predict centuries ahead when the heavens would echo the pattern of the first time, Zep Tepi. And they made sure the pyramids would still be there to witness it. That idea, that the universe moves in loops, not lines, survives everywhere. The Mayans called it the Great Cycle, the Hindus, the Yuga, the Egyptians, the eternal return of Ra through the underworld. Different cultures, same insight. Time is not a river, it's a wheel. If you understand its turning, you can prepare for the next crest. You can survive the flood. So the pyramids became both observatory and archive. Every measurement encoded data about the sky, the angle of the ecliptic, the precession of equinoxes, even the length of the solar year to within seconds. All without telescopes, only with patience. It's almost unsettling to realize that they probably knew more about celestial motion than most people alive today. Their worldview wasn't smaller than ours, it was wider. We reached upward with rockets, they reached inward with proportion. When you consider how much of that knowledge we lost, how many centuries it took us to rediscover it, the stones begin to feel like teachers waiting for students. Every time we decode another alignment, another ratio, it's as if they nod quietly, acknowledging that we've remembered a little more. Maybe that's why these monuments attract of people even now who come not just to study but to feel. They sense that buried under myth and erosion lies a design still functional, still communicating. The pyramid's shadow at equinox still divides the face exactly in half, still demonstrating the perfection of the builder's math. It's a message that repeats every year. Balance exists. Keep it. If we ever learn the entire celestial code, it probably won't be from finding a missing tablet or deciphering a lost language. It will come from understanding that the code was never separate from us. Our biology follows the same rhythms, heartbeats, circadian cycles, breath. We are microcosms of the same math the builders carved into limestone. The pyramid isn't pointing to the stars, it's pointing back to ourselves, to the realization that the laws written above us are the same ones written within. Under that sky, they must have known this. Perhaps that's why they built with such serenity, because they had already solved the hardest problem: how to belong to the cosmos without dominating it. Their structures endure because they didn't fight entropy. They flowed with it. The desert can erode but not erase them, because they are built on ratios that nature itself maintains. And so, every night, as Earth turns and the constellations slide slowly westward, the pyramids keep their vigil. The stars drift. The stones remain. Together they form a single instrument, one that plays a note only the patient can hear. It says, "Remember the pattern. You are part of it." When morning light breaks over the Giza plateau, the pyramids seem to breathe again. Their shadows stretch long, thin, like fingers reaching across time. It's easy to forget that someone once placed every one of those stones, that behind the mathematics and the astronomy were hands, human or otherwise, shaping matter into memory. But whose hands? Ancient texts say they belong to gods, not the distant, invisible deities of later religion, but beings who walked among men, radiant, tall, ageless. They arrived from the horizon in boats of light, bringing the sciences of number, medicine, and writing. The people called them the Shining Ones. Their leader, according to the old stories, was Thoth, master of wisdom, keeper of the balance, inventor of language itself. It's easy to dismiss those accounts as metaphor, but why did every culture describe the same pattern? Teachers from the sky or sea, appearing after a flood, carrying the tools to rebuild. In Mesopotamia, they were the Apkallu. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl. In Greece, Prometheus. Different names, same story, the gift of knowledge, the curse of memory. Perhaps those gods weren't celestial at all. Perhaps they were the last engineers of a fallen age, survivors of a civilization whose technology didn't look like ours. No metals, no engines, nothing that would rust or decay, only sound, light, magnetism. To those who lived in huts of mud, that knowledge would look divine. The survivors themselves would seem immortal, not because they couldn't die, but because their understanding kept them alive when the world drowned. Archaeologists find hints of an elite class of builders existing before dynastic Egypt, the so-called followers of Horus. Their graves show no sign of labour or war. They appear suddenly, fully formed, in the record, then vanish. No childhood skeletons, no transitional culture. It's as if they walked in from somewhere else, did their work and moved on. Their bones show unusual strength, thickened muscle attachments, healed injuries that suggest long lives of heavy, precise work. Hands that did not age in the ordinary sense, hands accustomed to lifting stone as if it were language. Even today, Artisans who work with stone speak of it almost mystically. They feel where to cut by resonance, by the song it sings when struck. The ancient builders must have known that song intimately. They tuned entire quarries the way musicians tune strings. Some hieroglyphs depict priests holding tuning forks and scepters pointed toward blocks of granite, symbols of sound, vibration, and control. We used to read those images as ritual. Maybe they were instruction manuals. If you stand inside the Great Pyramid's Grand Gallery and speak softly, your voice becomes more than your own. It lengthens, deepens, merges with something larger. The sound seems to slide up the walls and hover. It's easy to believe that the builders understood this and designed it deliberately. Granite conducts sound. Limestone amplifies it. The combination creates standing waves that can make air vibrate visibly. To master that effect, you need intuition that borders on empathy with matter. The question, then, is not whether they could do it, but why. What were they trying to achieve by turning stone into an instrument? Some say it was spiritual, a way to speak to the gods. But maybe it was practical, a technology of energy before electricity, a way to move, cut, and lift using resonance. Imagine teams of builders chanting at specific frequencies, while others struck the rock in rhythm, fracturing it along molecular lines without tools. No pulleys, no chisels, just vibration. Science has shown that ultrasound can levitate particles. High-frequency resonance can cut metal. Scale that knowledge, and the impossible becomes physical. If that sounds fantastical, remember that myth often hides physics. The words of power the priests spoke to raise temples may have been literal. Tonal instructions, sound-based engineering. To command the elements, you first have to understand them. And maybe that's what the Shining Ones taught. Not superstition, but technique. The lost physics of harmony. Their divinity was comprehension, and comprehension looks like magic to those who don't have it. If they seemed ageless, it was because knowledge suspends decay. Those who understand nature don't struggle against it. They move with it. Even in later centuries, Egyptian stonemasons claimed descent from the first builders. They said their ancestors could melt stone like wax. Modern tests on certain blocks at Giza reveal vitrification, surfaces fused as though exposed to intense even heat. To generate that uniformly across thousands of tons would require technology we still find difficult. Yet there it is, silent proof that something more than hammer and copper chisel was at play. Maybe those hands that never aged weren't superhuman. Maybe they were just human enough to listen, to treat the planet not as material, but as partner. We dig, they harmonized, we extract, they persuaded. The difference lies in attitude, not anatomy. In temple carvings, Thoth records every measurement of creation on a tablet. He's always depicted writing, never speaking, as if to say the act of inscription itself preserves reality. The first builders did the same with stone. Every block a syllable, every angle a consonant, every proportion a vowel. Together they wrote a sentence we're still sounding out. If you run your hand along the limestone today, the surface is warm even hours after sunset. It stores heat, releases it slowly, like breath. It's tempting to imagine those ancient hands touching the same surface, feeling the same warmth, understanding that endurance is a form of life. They weren't building graves, they were building organisms, structures that breathe light, temperature, sound. In that sense, the pyramids are still alive, still aging slowly in their own geological rhythm. No one knows what happened to those builders. Some say they ascended to the stars, others that they withdrew to hidden lands, waiting for the world to be ready again. Maybe neither. Maybe they simply blended into the populations they saved, their knowledge diluted generation by generation until it became myth. Time does that. It turns teachers into gods, equations into legends. But the fingerprints remain, literal ones pressed into limestone blocks, prints so deep they've survived 40 centuries of erosion. The hands are gone, but the gesture remains. That's what gives the pyramids their strange intimacy. They feel impersonal, cosmic, mathematical. Yet standing before them you sense humanity. You sense touch. Every stone was lifted by breath, heartbeat, intention. Each placement was a decision, not an accident. The scale is incomprehensible, but the craft is personal. It's like hearing a symphony and realizing every note was once a single breath in a single pair of lungs. Those hands, whoever they were, left us more than monuments. They left us the memory of what cooperation with the world can create. They proved that precision need not be mechanical, that faith and physics can share the same language. We inherit their legacy every time we balance beauty and reason, every time we build something meant to last beyond us. In that way, the hands never aged because their work never stopped. Their pulse continues in the structures that still stand, in the ideas that still resonate, in the curiosity that still drives us to ask how. They built so that wonder itself would be self-sustaining, and as long as someone keeps standing beneath those stones, listening, wondering, measuring, remembering, the builders are still building. There are nights in the desert when the horizon disappears. The stars drop so low they seem to brush the dunes, and the line between heaven and earth dissolves. Maybe that's why the ancients spoke of the sky not as a ceiling but as a shore. If you lived beneath that ocean of light long enough, you'd start to believe that something could cross it. They said the teachers came from there, not in the thunder and spectacle of modern fantasy, but quietly, like sunrise. The stories call them the Watchers, the Bright Ones, the Travellers. Beings who descended when the world was still recovering from flood and fire, bringing order where chaos reigned. They taught how to measure, how to plant, how to heal. And when their work was done, they left, promising to return when the stars resumed their former paths. Every culture repeats this memory in its own accent. The Dogon of Mali tell of Nommo, fish-like messengers who came from Sirius B, an invisible star modern astronomers discovered only in the 19th century. The Sumerians remembered the Anunnaki, who shaped humanity and returned to the heavens. The Egyptians told of Osiris and Isis descending in boats of light to restore the Nile's rhythm after the Great Flood. Different languages, same story. Knowledge from the sky, lost and rediscovered. It's tempting to read that literally, to imagine spacecraft landing on the plateau. But maybe the sky didn't mean outer space. Maybe it meant something subtler, the higher regions of understanding, the realm of pattern, mathematics, and vibration. When wisdom arrives suddenly, it always feels like revelation, as though light itself has descended. Perhaps the visitors were not extraterrestrial but extratemporal, humans from a cycle before the flood, returning to guide the next one. The past can look like the future if enough time has folded between. If that sounds impossible, consider what we know about memory. Information can survive longer than flesh. Stone holds data, DNA holds instructions, myths hold design. Each generation decodes what the last left behind, mistaking inheritance for inspiration. So when the first kings of Egypt spoke of gods who built before them, they may have been speaking of ancestors so ancient their bones had become legend. Still, the details are uncanny. The Dogon knew the orbit of Sirius B and its 50-year cycle. They drew it in sand long before telescopes. Coincidence, perhaps, or transmission. A remnant of star knowledge preserved by oral tradition. When you hear that, you realize the visitors never had to descend in ships. They could have come as stories, as calculations whispered across continents. The real miracle isn't that they arrived, but that we still remember they did. And if we strip the myth of its drama, we're left with a pattern. After every collapse, something or someone restores direction. A spark of organization, an architecture of renewal. Maybe visitors from the sky is the poetic way of describing the return of order itself, gravity visiting chaos, law visiting accident, reason visiting despair. Yet the ancients didn't speak about them like metaphors. They spoke with intimacy, gratitude, and sometimes fear. Their gods were not abstractions. They were teachers who could be angered, persuaded, thanked. In temple art, they're shown with the heads of birds, symbol of vision. Wings not for flight, but for perspective. The ability to see the whole pattern at once. If the visitors were human, they were different kinds of humans, guardians of a knowledge so large it fractured under translation. When they explained magnetism, it became magic. When they described vibration, it became incantation. When they spoke of resonance, it became prayer. By the time their students wrote the lessons down, the science had turned into myth. That's how you protect knowledge from forgetfulness. You wrap it in story. Archaeologists still find references to tools that no longer exist. Rods of power, sacred fire, the sound that moves stone. To a modern ear, these sound like metaphors. To the builders, they might have been blueprints. If you can control resonance, you can shape matter. That idea runs through every myth about creation. The universe spoken into being, sound preceding light. It isn't fantasy, it's physics stated poetically. And maybe the visitors were those who remembered the first tone. Even now, traces of that language survive in ritual, chants that use exact frequencies, temples designed to hum when wind passes through. A visitor listening today might recognize those as fragments of a code, bits of operating system left over from a civilization that once tuned itself to the planet. The question that lingers is where they went. The legends say they returned to the sky, but the sky might just mean elsewhere. Another layer of reality, another rhythm of existence. Perhaps they didn't vanish, they shifted phase. When you understand energy deeply enough, travel becomes translation. You move not through distance, but through vibration. We can't follow because we no longer speak that language, and yet their fingerprints remain. In architecture, in myth, in the very layout of our cities. Our modern capitals still mimic star maps. Washington aligned to Sirius, Paris to Orion, Beijing to the Pole Star. The impulse to mirror the heavens never left us. Maybe it's genetic, passed down from those early teachers who told us, build in the image of the sky, and you will never be lost. When we send probes to Mars or telescopes beyond the solar wind, we're reenacting the same gesture, reaching upward for the place our myths say we came from. The visitors might smile at that, seeing that their lesson endured. They taught us to look up, not to escape Earth, but to remember how vast home really is. If they ever return, we might not notice. They would come the way they always did, quietly, through understanding. A sudden leap in insight, a harmony discovered, a truth so elegant it feels familiar. That's their real signature, knowledge that arrives like remembering. Perhaps that's already happening. Each discovery we make about vibration, frequency, consciousness, magnetism feels less like invention and more like rediscovery. We're piecing together the same old melody note by note. The visitors don't need to descend. Their message has already landed, written into the proportions of our world. Every stone that still hums with energy is their voice continuing its sentence. And maybe, just maybe, when the stars realign to the pattern they once marked in the desert, we'll hear it clearly again. The conversation that never ended, only went quiet. Until then, the pyramids wait, their tips still pointing at the sky that gave them purpose, the sky that might one day answer. When people first crawl into the Great Pyramid, they expect stillness. What they don't expect is vibration. Not the loud kind, the kind that exists just at the edge of hearing, a faint pressure in the skull that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. It's as though the whole structure is breathing very slowly, once every few centuries. The more we study the pyramid, the less it resembles architecture, and the more it resembles a mechanism. Not a machine of gears and fuel, but a device that runs on harmony, geometry translated into energy. Every block, every void, every narrow passage seems placed with mathematical precision that has nothing to do with aesthetics or even comfort. It's as if someone built the world's largest musical instrument and then sealed it, trusting the planet itself to play the note. Sound behaves strangely inside stone. In the king's chamber, a whisper carries for seconds, overlapping with itself until it becomes a tone. Scientists have measured it. The granite resonates at 4 distinct frequencies, all of them harmonic multiples of one another. That's not random. The builders selected rock that vibrates like crystal when struck. Each block, tens of tons heavy, fits so tightly that no mortar is needed. The air itself becomes the only moving part, a resonant cavity that never decays. Imagine designing a structure not to be seen, but to sing, to turn the movement of the earth, the rumble of its core, even the thunder that rolls across the desert into sound that focuses upward through passageways tuned like organ pipes. If you stand in the grand gallery and hum the right note, the walls answer. The vibration climbs toward the ceiling, merges, and returns deeper, lower, purer. You feel it in your bones, the same way whales feel ocean currents through distance. The pyramid is doing the same thing, listening to the planet, translating gravity into echo. Maybe that was the intention, a structure that monitored Earth's own frequencies, a geological stethoscope. Modern engineers use similar principles in seismographs and acoustic sensors. They measure resonance to understand stress. But this was built thousands of years ago, before iron tools, before any known concept of mechanical engineering. And yet it functions like one. It converts the weight of itself into stability. the tremor of the ground into music, a perpetual equilibrium. We call it tomb because we can't imagine any other reason to build so big for no living audience. But what if it was never about death? What if it was about life, the life of the planet itself, a machine built to keep balance, to tune the Earth like a stringed instrument that might otherwise drift out of key? We think of machines as noisy, metallic, fast. This one is silent, mineral, eternal. There are clues hidden in the angles. The descending passage meets the ascending one at a point that divides the pyramid exactly according to the golden ratio. That proportion occurs in waveforms, in sound, in light, in DNA. It's the number the universe uses when it builds itself. To carve it into limestone on such a scale suggests purpose, not coincidence. Every chamber echoes that ratio. The Queen's chamber, smaller, resonates an octave higher than the King's. The subterranean chamber, rough and unfinished, an octave lower. Together they form a triad, 3 notes that define harmony in any scale. The entire structure could be read as a chord played on the instrument of the earth. Was it designed to create sound or to receive it? The answer may be both. Energy flows in cycles. A true machine doesn't force, it cooperates. When lightning strikes the plateau, the current travels through the bedrock, dispersing beneath the pyramid's base. The limestone casing, once polished to mirror brightness, would have conducted static charge. Inside, the granite cores, rich with quartz and feldspar, would have converted that charge into vibration. Stone transducers, using the same piezoelectric effect that powers modern sonar. What we call coincidence, nature calls design. If that seems fanciful, consider this. In laboratories, researchers have found that pyramidal shapes concentrate electromagnetic fields toward their centers. They act like capacitors, gathering subtle energy from their environment. It's not mystical, it's geometry. The angle of 51 degrees channels field lines efficiently, minimizing loss. Scale that principle up to the Great Pyramid's dimensions, and you get a natural collector the size of a mountain. Was it intentional? Perhaps. Or perhaps the builders discovered empirically what we rediscovered mathematically. Form is function, and form here is everything. The pyramid's base isn't square by accident. It mirrors the 4 directions anchoring to the magnetic field. The tip, long eroded, once capped with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, both superb conductors. When sunlight struck it, the pyramid would have glowed. Some early travellers described it as shining like a star fallen to earth. A metaphor, maybe, but fitting. A star that listens rather than burns. Inside, each passage narrows, then widens again. A design we'd call waveguides today. Air pressure, sound, even temperature follow patterns through these tunnels that seem engineered rather than accidental. If you release a tone in one chamber, it travels, transforms, emerges elsewhere changed but coherent, just as a signal does in circuitry. The resemblance to acoustic engineering is uncanny. To the ancient mind, this was not technology, it was communion. To us, technology implies separation, user and tool, operator and instrument. To them, tool and world were the same. They built machines that blended with landscape, devices that looked like mountains because they were meant to merge with them. Their power source wasn't fire or fuel, but alignment. They fed on harmony. It's possible that every large temple complex in Egypt was part of a network of these resonant structures, each tuned to a specific frequency, each connected by the Nile, which itself conducts sound beneath the ground. If you imagine the entire valley vibrating subtly in unison, the picture changes. Not isolated monuments, but a single planetary scale experiment in energy management. A civilization listening to its planet as though it were alive, and treating it that way. When explorers talk about the energy they feel at these sites, skeptics laugh. But walk into one at dawn when the air's cool and still, and you'll feel it too. Not mystical power, but the simple physics of resonance. The same phenomenon that makes a violin string vibrate when another across the room is struck. The stones remember sound. They store it as stress, release it as warmth. Over centuries, that memory becomes atmosphere. You step inside and your own body becomes part of the system, heart rate slowing, breath synchronizing with the rhythm that lives in the walls. That's not illusion, it's interaction. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about the pyramids is that they were built to impress. They weren't. They were built to stabilize. They make the desert itself less chaotic, their weight pressing into fault lines, redistributing stress. Even now, satellites detect a slight magnetic anomaly over Giza, a faint but measurable shift that pulses with the solar cycle. Coincidence, perhaps, or the remnant heartbeat of a machine still half awake. There's an ancient Egyptian phrase found carved in small shrines. To build is to remember. That may have been the operating principle of these machines of stone. They remembered the planet before the flood, before the tilt, before the forgetfulness. By recreating the geometry of the stable world, the builders believed they could preserve it. Their machines didn't move. They anchored. They kept the universe from drifting too far into disorder. If that sounds abstract, picture a tuning fork placed beside another. Strike one and the other hums. Now scale that to a planet. When the Earth hums, through earthquakes, thunder, tide, the pyramids answer. Each tremor through the crust sets them ringing imperceptibly, rebalancing tension, dissipating chaos through symmetry. They may be the reason this land remained habitable when other regions fractured. A self-correcting architecture, using physics disguised as devotion. What's extraordinary is how this concept reappears globally. Megalithic circles in Britain, temples in Peru, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, each one built on nodes of magnetic flux, each oriented to the stars. Different builders, same design language. It's as if the knowledge behind them wasn't owned but remembered collectively, resurfacing wherever humans listened deeply enough. The pyramids are simply the clearest expression of that memory, geometry so refined it became eternal. And maybe that's what the builders intended. A technology that wouldn't need maintenance, operators, or updates. Once aligned, it would run forever, drawing energy from sunlight, gravity, and vibration. A perpetual conversation between form and force. Even eroded, it continues. The casing stone's gone, the capstone missing, yet the harmony intact. Because harmony doesn't require perfection, it only requires relationship. When modern engineers model the structure, they find an uncanny efficiency. Its volume to surface ratio minimizes weathering. Its weight distribution makes collapse nearly impossible. Its geometry resists wind like a mountain, but channels it like an engine. You could hardly design a better way to let time itself pass through you without damage. It's no wonder the pyramid became the universal symbol for stability. It's literally the shape of equilibrium, and inside that equilibrium is a lesson. We chase speed, noise, constant movement. The builders sought stillness, the kind that amplifies rather than silences. They knew that true power doesn't shout, it hums. The machine they made was meant to remind every generation of that truth. The most enduring energy is harmony itself. Even now, lying beneath stars that have shifted since the first stone was placed, the Great Pyramid continues its silent operation. The desert cools, air contracts, sound waves ripple through the bedrock, and the ancient device breathes again. It needs no switch, no maintenance, only patience. Because patience is the engine of eternity. If one day the last human leaves this place, the pyramid will still stand, still humming at 432 hertz, still translating the movement of the earth into music. It will not notice our absence. It will simply keep performing its task, to preserve balance, to keep time, to remind whatever comes next that intelligence once meant listening. The desert is silent, but silence is never empty. Beneath it, the ground trembles with frequencies too low for ears to hear, pulses of pressure that roll through the crust like invisible tides. Every planet does this. Each world sings its own note, a deep vibration born from rotation, molten core and gravity. The ancients might not have used the word resonance, but they felt it under their feet. They built with it in mind. The Great Pyramid hums in sympathy with those frequencies. Modern instruments record micro-oscillations between 7 and 8 cycles per second, the same rhythm that echoes in human brainwaves when we dream. Coincidence, again, or intention? The same pattern occurs in temples across Egypt, Peru, and Asia, as though every civilization tried to tune its monuments to the Earth's slow heartbeat. When you walk among them, you feel it as calm. Your body falls into step with the planet's pulse. Your breath lengthens. Your thoughts quiet. It's easy to imagine that this was the real purpose of sacred architecture, to bring the human nervous system into phase with the world's. A machine not of metal, but of alignment, humanity's first technology of resonance. Long before scientists measured frequencies, builders read them. They noticed how certain shapes amplified wind, how hollows deep in rock carried sound for miles. They learned that every material had a pitch, sandstone soft and warm, granite sharp and clear. To construct with both was to create harmony between heaven and earth, solid and air. When thunder rolled across the plateau, the pyramid didn't resist it. It joined in, capturing the vibration and returning it to the sky in a lower tone. A conversation between elements, not a battle. At dawn, the first light enters the corridors like a current. It slides down polished walls, igniting dust into gold. The temperature difference between day and night creates pressure, and the whole monument breathes, expanding, contracting, whispering its slow reply to the desert. That respiration, multiplied across millennia, has kept the inner chambers stable while lesser buildings crumble. The pyramid flexes with the planet's lungs. Maybe that's why the builders called the land Kemet, the black soil, the living body of the earth. To them, the ground wasn't dead matter. It was flesh, pulsing with hidden energy. They aligned stone to its meridians the way a healer places hands on arteries. Each monument a pressure point, balancing invisible flow. The priests who tended these sites weren't caretakers of tombs. They were technicians of equilibrium. Modern science stumbles onto the same principles. Geomagnetic surveys show that the pyramid sits exactly atop a junction where fault lines converge. Seismic energy gathers there and dissipates harmlessly, like static grounded through a wire. It's possible the placement wasn't luck but intention, a stabilizer for a restless Earth. Every planet needs ballast. Maybe this was ours. When lightning strikes nearby, sensors pick up spikes inside the pyramid, faint but measurable. Quartz veins in the granite core convert electromagnetic bursts into vibration, piezoelectric resonance. That's the same phenomenon used in watches to keep perfect time. Our ancestors may have built a planetary metronome centuries before we named electricity. And yet, to them, this wasn't science, it was devotion. They didn't separate knowledge from reverence. To understand something was to love it. To tune a structure to the Earth's pulse was an act of gratitude. They believed balance was moral, not mechanical. Disorder was sin, resonance was virtue. If the Earth is alive, then the pyramids are its organs, crystalline lungs exhaling symmetry, each stone a cell, each chamber a heartbeat. The builders might have known that when harmony breaks, catastrophe follows, floods, quakes, collapses. So they built correctives, monuments that remember stability even when everything else forgets. Look at the distribution of pyramids along the Nile. They form a pattern, nodes spaced almost rhythmically along the river's length. If you plot them on a modern grid, the distances correlate to acoustic wavelengths of the Schumann resonance. The same pattern reappears in the spacing of Mayan temples and Chinese mounds. Different cultures, same mathematics, same pulse. The implication is staggering. A global architecture tuned to the same unseen rhythm, as if the planet itself had whispered instructions. Perhaps it did. Perhaps resonance is simply communication that travels deeper than language. Stone and soil respond to it. Water carries it. The human body translates it into emotion. The builders didn't need instruments. They were instruments. They felt frequency through skin and bone, the way birds sense magnetic north. We lost that sensitivity when we stopped listening. Some claim the pyramids still affect that resonance. At certain times of the year, the global frequency shifts slightly, as though something in the crust has changed tension. It's too subtle to notice unless you're measuring, but the data exists. No one can prove cause and effect, but coincidence keeps piling like sand. Imagine, then, that every pyramid, obelisk and stone circle was part of one vast design, a planetary lattice meant to keep our world coherent, a safety net woven of vibration. If the system ever failed completely, climate and magnetism might spiral into chaos again. Another flood, another reset. That sounds mystical until you remember that our entire magnetic shield depends on frequency. The Earth hums or we die. In this light, the builders weren't priests at all. They were maintainers, caretakers of resonance. They observed, recorded, rebuilt when necessary. Their religion was maintenance. Their prayer was proportion. To stand among their works is to feel the weight of that responsibility. Every surface calibrated, every shadow timed. The air inside still carries their fingerprints in pressure. Touch the wall and you complete the circuit. They designed it that way. The human body closes the loop, adding one more pulse to the planetary song. At night, the stars glide slowly overhead. The pyramid's apex points not to a single star now, but to an empty patch of sky, a memory of alignment lost to precession. Yet the resonance continues. Perhaps the builders anticipated drift. Perhaps they built adaptability into the design. As above, So below, when the heavens move, the earth compensates. Balance never breaks, it only migrates. If you listen long enough, you start to hear patterns that are older than culture. The soft hiss of wind over sand, the slow percussion of waves against forgotten shores, the deep rumble of mountains shifting in their sleep. These are not random noises. They're the language of the planet. Every tone, every vibration, a syllable in an endless sentence about balance. The ancients understood that to live well you had to join that conversation. They learned to match their pulse to the pulse beneath them. Villages grew where the earth's voice was strongest, places where springs bubbled, where magnetic stone hummed, where the night air felt alive. They built shrines there, not to worship but to synchronize. A home, a temple, a body, each was a resonator. The goal was never domination, it was participation. Walk through the ruins and you can still sense it. Walls curve to catch echoes, stairs that double as instruments when struck by wind, carvings placed where sound lingers longest. Every detail designed to remind the inhabitants that existence itself is vibration. They didn't have our word frequency, but they had the experience of it in their bones. They knew that when harmony slipped, sickness followed, first in people, then in the land. That knowledge was both science and faith. Their calendars measured resonance as much as time, solstice, equinox, the beat between light and dark. Festivals were tuning rituals. Drums and flutes weren't entertainment, they were medicine. To dance in rhythm was to repair the link between heart and horizon. The body, they believed, was a small pyramid. Bones as pillars, breath as wind, voice as vibration. Keep it tuned and the larger structure, the earth itself, would remain in tune. Modern physics stumbles toward the same conclusion. Everything oscillates. Atoms, cells, ecosystems, planets. Energy never rests. It simply changes tempo. When frequencies align, matter becomes stable. When they clash, it breaks apart. What we call harmony, nature calls survival. The pyramid builders may have grasped that intuitively, shaping the world into a giant stabilizing chord. In recent years, researchers recorded electromagnetic readings inside the Great Pyramid during thunderstorms. The results showed amplification, a measurable increase in field strength along the internal shafts. The geometry itself focuses energy, guiding it the way a lens guides light. No wires, no batteries, just shape and stone. Form as function. The machine still works because the laws it uses never expired. Imagine an age when understanding resonance meant power. Not the power to destroy, but to sustain. Cities could be designed as symphonies, each building a note, each river a rhythm. Harmony produced abundance. Dissonance invited ruin. The priesthood's duty was to keep the song coherent. When famine came, they retuned the temples, recalibrated ceremonies, listened for imbalance in the music of wind and water. They were scientists disguised as singers. We've inherited the ruins but not the score. We measure but rarely listen. We dissect sound but forget silence, which is merely sound at rest. The ancients built for both. Their pyramids are chords frozen mid-resonance, proof that stillness can contain motion. That's why standing near them feels paradoxical. Your body quiets, yet your thoughts vibrate. The architecture is performing exactly as intended. Some scholars speculate that resonance was also used to preserve knowledge. Granite blocks could encode patterns through microscopic stress. Vibration leaves memory, quartz remembers strain. Perhaps every wall in the king's chamber is a library written in frequency rather than ink, waiting for instruments subtle enough to read it. If so, the pyramids are not monuments to what we've lost, but vaults for what we have yet to understand. There is another possibility, simpler but just as profound. Maybe the builders realized that harmony itself was the message, that if future generations forgot the words, the shapes alone would reteach them. A pyramid doesn't explain, it demonstrates. Its silence invites imitation. Build anything with care, in balance, and you are already remembering what they knew. When storms roll over the plateau, thunder reverberates between the pyramids like drums answering each other. For a few minutes the air becomes orchestra. Wind, sand, lightning, stone. Then it fades back to quiet. You're left with a sense that the earth has just exhaled. That this, right now, is the heartbeat the ancients tried to preserve. They must have known how fragile it is. Magnetic fields shift, climates wander, stars drift. Yet within all that motion, there's a baseline that never changes. They built to that baseline. They tuned civilization to the note the planet sings when it's healthy. Maybe we could too, if we remember to listen. Stand alone at Giza at dawn. The sand still cold, the air perfectly still. Birds stir somewhere beyond sight. You feel the faint tremor through your feet, the hum of an ancient chord still playing. It rises through your spine until your breath falls into rhythm with it. For a moment, there's no separation between you and the world. The same vibration that shakes distant galaxies is moving through your chest. That realization is what the builders wanted you to find. Not aliens, not magic, not even mystery, just relationship. The proof that matter and meaning are the same thing expressed at different speeds. They wrote it in stone because stone doesn't forget. They left it open because truth doesn't need guarding. They called it by many names: Ma'at, balance, harmony, life. We call it resonance. It's still here, still singing, waiting for us to tune ourselves back to it. And when we do, when enough of us stand quietly and listen, the planet will recognize the sound, the machine will wake, the earth will hear its own voice again. The first time you notice it, it feels like coincidence. A pyramid here, another half a world away, then another. Different stones, different cultures, same geometry. After a while, coincidence begins to feel like repetition, and repetition begins to feel like memory. From the jungles of Central America to the valleys of China, from the Bosnian hills to the Sudanese desert, the same shape keeps rising. A square base, 4 sides tapering upward to a single point, sometimes stair-stepped, sometimes smooth, but always aiming at the sky. It's as if the human mind, regardless of continent or language, was haunted by the same design. We tell ourselves that the pyramid is simply practical, the easiest way to build tall without collapse. And yet these structures aren't merely functional, they're symbolic. They appear even where smaller, easier buildings would suffice. The form itself mattered. Something in it resonated with the builders of every age. Consider the distances. Thousands of miles separate the Great Pyramid of Giza from the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan, yet their dimensions echo one another. Their bases nearly identical, their orientations aligned to cardinal points, their angles hovering around that same impossible 51 degrees. both sit at the heart of civilizations obsessed with the stars. Both were built by societies that claimed their knowledge came from those who came before. How does the same obsession emerge in places that never met? Some explanations appeal to psychology. The pyramid as a universal metaphor, stability rising toward aspiration. Others to geology. The shape mimics mountains, humanity's first temples. But maybe the truth lies deeper. Maybe the pattern is not just cultural, but planetary. Perhaps the Earth itself teaches this form, whispering it through instinct the way a seashell learns to spiral. Patterns appear everywhere once you start to look. Ratios between pyramid heights and planetary circumferences. Angles that match magnetic latitudes. Alignments that tie monuments across oceans. The line from Giza through Easter Island to Nazca forms a near-perfect great circle, grazing ancient sites as if stitched by intention. A line no ancient traveller could have plotted on a globe, unless the knowledge was older than navigation. Historians call this coincidence, but coincidence, repeated too precisely, becomes design by another name. Maybe these monuments are not copies of one another, but expressions of a single template, a geometry encoded in the planet itself, rediscovered whenever human curiosity reaches a certain frequency. That template might have begun with sound. In experiments, sand sprinkled on vibrating plates arranges itself into patterns that mirror the forms of temples and pyramids. Triangles, spirals, concentric squares. Resonance shapes matter. Shape amplifies resonance. It's the same conversation repeated at every scale. Atoms, mountains, galaxies all follow similar ratios. When civilizations tried to build in harmony with nature, the pyramid was the inevitable answer. It's what happens when mathematics falls in love with gravity. Archaeologists prefer timelines to networks. They measure time, not pattern. But what if the pattern is the timeline? Each pyramid an entry in the same long experiment. The attempt to make permanence out of proportion. Maybe every culture that reached a certain threshold of understanding rediscovered the formula, thinking they'd invented it anew. They built not because they remembered the others, but because the earth reminded them. Even erosion obeys this rule. The same angle of repose, the slope at which sand naturally settles, is about 34 degrees. Stack that into terraces and you get the ziggurat, the step pyramid. Sharpen it to balance load and you get Giza. The planet's own physics insists on the pyramid. It's the grammar of gravity. And yet there's another layer. Orientation. Nearly every pyramid faces true north with astonishing accuracy. To achieve that in the distant past required long observation of the heavens. You'd have to track circumpolar stars, record their crossing points, average drift. Why did so many cultures go to that effort for the same result? Maybe they believed alignment itself carried power, that to face north was to face eternity, the one direction that never changes. Think of the effort that required. Hundreds of lives spent aligning stones to invisible stars, not for kings, but for continuity. It's devotion written in geometry, and it keeps repeating, because continuity is what every age fears losing most. When explorers ask local elders about their pyramids, the answers rarely mention ego or empire. They say, it was built before us. It was built by the first ones. It was already here. The story repeats from Yucatan to Indonesia. People inheriting monuments, not inventing them. Civilizations rising around reminders of earlier greatness, like seedlings growing from the fallen trees of a forest that once covered the world. Maybe that's what we're looking at, a planetary forest of memory, each pyramid a trunk from a single root system that stretched beneath oceans and millennia. The root is not a place, it's an idea, the idea that matter can remember meaning. That stone, shaped correctly, can keep the earth in tune. When the last casing stone of the Great Pyramid fell, no one replaced it. When the temples of Mexico cracked, no one repaired them. We admired, copied, moved on. But the pattern didn't stop. It migrated into our architecture. Skyscrapers taper, rockets narrow, even mountains we sculpt for mines end in triangular silhouettes. The planet keeps repeating its favourite shape through us. We can't help it. The geometry has become instinct. Maybe that's the pyramid's true immortality. Not that it resists time, but that time can't resist it. It reappears wherever intelligence tries to speak the language of permanence. Even our digital age, full of light and code, still calls its networks pyramids. Hierarchies, data stacks, energy grids. We haven't escaped the pattern, we've abstracted it, and perhaps that's appropriate. The builders might have intended it to evolve, a physical lesson that would one day turn into a mental one. The understanding that all creation, from stone to algorithm, is an act of balance, weight rising toward clarity. Stand at any of these sites at dusk and you'll see the same scene repeating across continents. The last sunlight touching the tip, a single point glowing while the base sinks into shadow. A simple metaphor, but a perfect one. Knowledge reaching upward while rooted in the world that gave it shape. That's why the form survives. It's not architecture, it's philosophy. And philosophy, once written, refuses to die. It changes names, languages, cultures, but the idea remains the same. Stability is sacred, harmony is eternal, the pattern endures. Every great silence hides an echo. Sometimes it takes centuries to hear it, carried through stone, through myth, through the way people build without remembering why. The pyramids are not isolated miracles. They are resonances of one idea, an idea that travelled farther than trade, farther than language. Stand in Giza, and you stand at the centre of a geometry that stretches across oceans. Follow its lines and you find reflections everywhere. In Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun rises from volcanic rock. Its stairs align to the setting of the same star that guided the Egyptians, Sirius. At dawn on certain days, light runs down its steps in waves, just as it once did on the limestone faces of Giza. Half a world apart, the rhythm is identical, stone catching sunrise like memory returning. Farther east, in the jungles of Cambodia, Angkor Wat carries the same code. Its towers climb in ratios of 3-4-5, the Pythagorean triangle, centuries before Pythagoras was born. Its central axis points to the constellation Draco, the same dragon that guarded the pole star above the Nile. The builders called their structure the home of the gods. The Egyptians said the same. Different gods, same home. And in the highlands of Peru, where the air thins and thunder hides in the mountains, the people of Caral raised stepped pyramids older than the pharaohs. No written language, no empire, yet the same precision. Their stones hum in wind, their plazas are tuned to the resonance of the earth below. They never met the architects of Egypt, but they knew the same secret, that geometry is a bridge, not a border. What connects them all isn't influence, it's instinct. Civilizations separated by oceans and centuries somehow discovered identical methods of aligning with the cosmos. It's as if human consciousness itself has a memory. a template it rediscovers whenever it looks for permanence. The ancients might have called that template divine, we might call it pattern recognition. But the result is the same, a world that keeps rebuilding the same shape because the shape feels true. Travellers who walked these paths noticed the repetition long before archaeologists did. Arab scholars in the Middle Ages wrote of mountains built by men in lands beyond the sea. Spanish chroniclers arriving in the Americas were stunned by how familiar the temples felt. The stairways, the orientation, the precision of joints. They asked the priests who built them. The answer was always the same. It was here when we arrived. It's tempting to see conspiracy in that. A single vanished culture scattering its knowledge before disappearing. But maybe the truth is less cinematic and more profound. Maybe every time humanity reaches a certain level of observation, the universe hands it the same tools. A reminder that we are not inventing mathematics, we are remembering it. We are tuning ourselves again to the resonant frequencies that never stopped humming beneath our feet. Look at the distribution of these sites on a map and a new picture forms. Draw a line through them, and you find that many fall near the equatorial band where the planet's magnetic field is strongest. Another cluster follows the energy lines where tectonic plates meet, where the Earth breathes heat and sound. The builders weren't chasing mystery, they were responding to it. They built where the planet spoke loudest. Some modern researchers call this the world grid. To skeptics, it's coincidence. To dreamers, it's design. Perhaps it's both, because coincidence, multiplied by purpose, becomes meaning, and meaning has a habit of surviving. In myth, these places are linked by travellers of light. The Inca told of Viracocha, a bearded teacher who walked the world after the flood, leaving knowledge behind. The Egyptians told of Thoth doing the same. The Polynesians speak of Tain, the bringer of dawn. Everywhere you find the same motif, the wanderer who reminds us of what we once knew. Maybe those stories record not one person, but one pattern of awakening, an echo moving through generations. What makes this echo so persistent is that it lives in both matter and mind. The physical pyramids draw our attention upward. The inner ones form when we start asking why. That's how the pattern reproduces itself. It doesn't rely on inheritance, it relies on curiosity. The moment someone looks at the sky and feels the urge to mirror it on Earth, the pattern is reborn. Think of it as a heartbeat that skips across millennia. Egypt, Mexico, Peru, China, each a pulse in the same cosmic circulation. Between them flows the quiet current of understanding, that the world is shaped by balance, that stability can be drawn from proportion. Every new generation forgets and remembers in turn, each time adding a layer of refinement, a new accent to the same ancient melody. And we are part of that rhythm too. Our satellites, our observatories, our grid lines across the globe. They are the same impulse in another medium. The International Space Station orbits in the shape of a stretched pyramid, its modules converging toward a single point. We didn't plan it for symbolism, but the geometry emerged naturally. Form following resonance. Again, even our digital networks map themselves as pyramids, hierarchies of data, foundations of information tapering towards singularity. The pattern migrates from stone to code, from hand to algorithm. It refuses extinction. Maybe that's why the old structures still captivate us. They don't only remind us of the past, they predict the future. They show what happens when intelligence listens to nature instead of trying to outthink it. They whisper, build with the planet, not on top of it. And we're finally beginning to hear them again, through architecture that breathes, through technology that recycles, through cities designed to pulse rather than sprawl. The echo keeps returning until we answer. At dusk, when you stand before any of these pyramids, you feel the same pull. The light fades from the base upward, as if the monument is absorbing the last warmth of the day, storing it for the night ahead. That's what all of them are doing, storing memory, storing light. A collective archive of human awe, humming softly across time. The pattern that won't go away isn't carved in stone anymore, it's carved in us, in the way we keep reaching for equilibrium, for beauty that lasts longer than our own heartbeat. The ancient builders called it immortality, we call it progress. But it's the same thing, the echo of creation, repeating until the earl finally remembers the song. Stone remembers differently than we do. It doesn't dream, it doesn't speak, but it holds the past the way mountains hold the sea, slowly, patiently, with weight. Every cut, every mark of pressure, every vibration that ever touched it still exists somewhere in its crystalline lattice. Geologists call it strain history. The ancients called it memory. When they built with stone, they weren't just building for strength, they were building for recall. Each block a page, each joint a sentence, the whole monument a library written in vibration instead of words. They believed that whatever you build in perfect harmony can never truly die. It resonates forever in the background of the world, waiting for recognition. That's why the pyramids never feel old. They feel awake. Weathered, yes, but alert. Like sentinels that have been listening for so long they've learned to dream standing up. They don't just occupy the landscape, they influence it. The air around them feels organized. Even the wind seems to move in rhythm. We think of time as erosion, but to stone, time is just rehearsal. Each sunrise polishes its surface a little smoother. Each storm tightens its grain. What we call decay, the stone experiences as memory consolidating, details blurring into essence, and the essence of the pyramids is endurance. No writing, no voice, no record, yet their message has survived longer than any alphabet. It's a message made of proportion, silence, and patience. Stand beside them and you feel what they're saying even if you can't translate it. They speak in the grammar of gravity. In a world where everything ages, stone cheats entropy, not by resisting it, but by embracing it. Every molecule of limestone is in constant vibration, trading energy with the air. That exchange is decay and renewal at once. The builders knew this. They watched stone breathe heat during the day and release it at night, watched how its expansion and contraction mirrored the lungs of living creatures. Maybe that's why they saw no line between the living and the material. To them, stone was alive in a slower tempo. It's a thought modern science is catching up to. Physicists describe the universe as a field of oscillation, nothing truly solid, only waves in temporary form. If everything vibrates, then everything remembers. A pyramid isn't dead rock, it's frozen frequency. And when the wind or thunder, or even your heartbeat meets that frequency, information passes between you. You walk away slightly changed. That's memory at work, written not in neurons but in resonance. The ancients seemed to know this intuitively. They placed their temples where stone spoke most clearly, granite with high quartz content, limestone that rang when struck. They treated quarrying as a ritual, the awakening of the mountain. Each block cut was first sounded, its pitch recorded to ensure harmony with its neighbours. They built as composers, not as masons. When the last stone fell into place, the structure wasn't complete. It was tuned, and because it was tuned, it could remember what it was tuned to. The pulse of the earth, the rhythm of the stars, the collective breath of everyone who had stood there before. Every visitor becomes part of the record, another vibration etched into the field. Even now, tourists chatting inside the king's chamber add their frequencies to a data set millions of years deep. The pyramid listens without judgment. That's what memory is. Attention stretched through time. Perhaps that's why these monuments outlive empires. Empires write in ink, and ink fades. They carve their glory into stone, but stone listens to everyone equally. Conqueror and slave, builder and pilgrim, raindrop and whisper. It records without hierarchy. In the end, it forgets us all into the same melody. If you walk along the base of the Great Pyramid at night, you can hear your footsteps multiply. The sound doesn't echo back. It folds outward, absorbed into the mass. The structure doesn't return your noise. It digests it. Somewhere inside, the vibration lingers. Maybe that's what ghosts are. Vibrations that never found their way out. Maybe the pyramid is full of them. A chorus of every voice that's ever entered. In a sense, we are the same. The calcium in our bones was once stone. The iron in our blood was once star core. We are made of memory, walking around pretending to be present tense. The builders might have known that too, that by aligning human life with the geometry of stone, they were acknowledging their own mineral ancestry. To build a pyramid was to write oneself back into the planet's autobiography. That's why these structures feel sacred without any religion attached. They make you aware of duration. They remind you that your heartbeat is brief but not meaningless. It's a note inside an ongoing chord. You don't have to believe in gods to feel reverence here. You just have to stand still long enough for the silence to start speaking. Every generation that rediscovers these places adds another layer of interpretation, another translation of the same vibration. To early explorers, they were tombs. To mystics, initiatory chambers. To scientists, observatories. To engineers, impossibilities. To artists, perfection. They can be all those things because their meaning isn't fixed. Like a melody, it changes depending on who listens. And perhaps that was the intent all along. The builders' new language would die. Myths would contradict. Calendars would reset. Only one thing endures across all time. The feeling of standing before something vast and precise, and knowing it was made by hands that understood the universe better than you do. That feeling is the true message, or as continuity. Stone doesn't need us to believe in it. It doesn't care if we solve its equations or call them coincidence. It simply exists, waiting for the next listener. Maybe that's why we keep returning, generation after generation, to touch its surface and whisper questions it won't answer, because we recognize ourselves in it, the part of us that refuses to be erased. Dawn arrives without ceremony over Giza. The light touches the tips of the pyramids first, as though asking permission before waking the rest of the desert. For a few seconds, the limestone glows the colour of old honey, and you understand why the ancients called this place the horizon of heaven. It feels less like sunrise and more like remembrance. The world has changed 1,000 times since these stones were lifted. Empires came and went, rivers shifted course, languages turned to dust. But the pyramids never moved. They wait, patient as mountains, while history circles around them like wind over dunes. You can measure that patience in every grain of sand pressed between the blocks, sand that has outlasted every human plan. We have measured, mapped, scanned, simulated. We know the weight of each block, the chemistry of the mortar, the alignment to the stars, and still the central question stays intact. Why? Why build something so precise that it could survive the collapse of memory itself? Maybe the answer was never meant to be solved. Maybe the purpose of the mystery is to keep us looking up. Because every time we look up, we become more like the people who built them. Curious, patient, humbled by scale. It's the act of wondering that connects us. The same act that carved the first tool and drew the first star map in sand. The pyramids are mirrors for that impulse. They don't explain. They reflect the question back at us until we see our own longing in it. Stand there long enough, and you start to notice something gentle. The air above the plateau moves differently. Sound feels thicker, slower. Even the heartbeat calms. It's as if the entire place still hums with an inaudible note, a tone that the builders tuned and left behind to keep the earth steady. The rational mind dismisses it as suggestion, but the body disagrees. The body recognizes resonance. That feeling is why the mystery matters, not because it hides aliens or lost continents, but because it hides us, our capacity for awe, our hunger to leave meaning behind. Every civilization builds its own monuments. Most crumble. These endure because they were designed not just for strength but for silence. Silence survives translation. Perhaps that was the final lesson of the builders, that permanence doesn't come from conquest or brilliance but from harmony. You can't dominate eternity. You can only align with it. To live in tune with the universe is to build something it chooses to protect. Look around our world now. Machines orbiting, data humming through invisible webs, towers of glass reaching for the same sky. We still chase the same geometry. Our monuments hum in new frequencies, servers instead of stones, light instead of limestone. But the intent hasn't changed. We still want to be remembered. We still want to prove we understood the pattern. Maybe one day our descendants will stand among our ruins and feel the same quiet question. Who were they? And how did they do this? And maybe, as they listen, they'll feel the same pulse running under their feet. The one that never stopped between us and the first builders. The earth humming to itself, carrying every note we've ever played. When the sun finally clears the horizon, the pyramids lose their glow and become shapes again. Simple, solid, inevitable. You realize that the real miracle isn't that they exist, it's that they still matter. They continue to remind us that mystery is not a flaw in understanding. It's the doorway through which understanding enters. Without mystery, there would be no science, no faith, no story to tell. So you stand there one last time, feeling the desert warm, hearing the soft wind sweep through the broken casing stones, and you understand what the builders must have known. That everything ends, but not all endings are loss. Some become foundations. The pyramids were never trying to solve the universe. They were trying to remember how to belong to it. And they succeeded, because even now, thousands of years later, the world still gathers at their base, still listens, still wonders. The machine still hums, the resonance still travels, and the mystery still stands.